Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. It's been a year since the miracle in Butler, and a lot of people won't like that phrasing, but it is what it is. I think it's very clear that Donald Trump was saved by something that day. And yet, despite this incredible event, we rarely talk about it. We rarely think about its implications. We rarely honor those that did die in that moment. And unfortunately, also, we haven't learned much about the people involved. Donald Trump had multiple people try to assassinate him. And to this day, we hear very little about the motivations or where these people came from, why the security detail was not up to snuff for Trump. Very little looking into that by the administration so far. Wanted to talk about this on the 1 year anniversary. Also, Donald Trump is looking at possibly sending more weapons to Ukraine, despite many people hoping that we would be winding that war down as soon as possible. And the New York Times has just admitted that they now have evidence of what pretty much everyone knew, that Joe Biden did not sign his own pardons, that in many cases he did not even evaluate the people to be pardoned. And this brings in the question, are those pardons in any way eligible? Like, are these legitimate? Would they actually hold up if they were put under scrutiny? Joining me to talk about all that today is everyone's favorite frog, the Prudentialist. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thank you again for having me on, Auron. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's just go with the anniversary stuff first. Like I said, I, like a lot of people, found out about this live. I was actually just leaving church that day and checked social media and saw that Donald Trump had been shot at. Did not know at first what had happened, had he survived, what was going on. Remember, a lot of people around the church, also simultaneously finding out they hadn't made any kind of announcement, but it's a large service, and we just we kind of heard the pockets of discussion as each person started to find out what was going on. A lot of people very concerned about whether the president had survived in these things. And as the events unfolded, we learned that Donald Trump had very narrowly escaped death, had, of course, been hit in the ear by a bullet that otherwise would have exploded his head on live television. And the fact that he had survived this simply because he had tilted his head very slightly when looking at an immigration chart, I think it is a miracle. I know that a lot of people are going to dislike that language, but I think the world is as enchanted as you want it to be. If you want to look for some kind of explanation for everything that's completely materialistic, you can do that. Yeah, I just happened to get lucky at just this moment with just this tilt to the head. Okay, but for me, especially at the distance the shot took place, that is quite an amazing thing. I think, though, we often don't also talk about Corey Compouture enough, somebody who went out of his way when he heard these bullets flying to put himself between his family and those bullets, and tragically, he did not was not spared this end, but he did go down, doing something that I think is incredibly virtuous, incredibly worthy, incredibly masculine, and something that deserves to be honored on a regular basis. So I just wanted to remind people that these are stories that are still incredibly powerful and relevant, even though our news cycle moves so fast that we barely talk about these things anymore. But Prudentialist, what are your thoughts on this 1 year anniversary of the missed assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, like you, I was also getting out of church. I was having dinner with some friends, and then all of a sudden someone's like, the president's been shot. And we all usually have like a no phones rule, but we all went for our phones to find out what had gone on, and found out just the same way I think millions of Americans did that day. And just like what we found out in the weeks that followed what happened a year ago, even to today, we still have little understanding of what took place. It is going to be, and this wasn't even the only time that the president had faced attempted assassination. And you're right, it was divine providence. It was something that had allowed him to look and turn his head at the right time to narrowly avoid probably whatever the assassin had wanted, whether it's whoever the parties or conspirators involved may have been. The goal was to have Donald Trump's head explode on live television for millions of people to see. and to demoralize and to strike fear in the hearts of every American that supported him or had ideas that were similar to what Trump purports to stand for, which is making America great again. So, thankfully that didn't take place. And we're here today now in the second Trump administration having conversations about anti-white policy and being the cause for sanctions and talking about mass deportations. So, I mean, we would not have this had any of those assassins been successful. And again, we're very grateful for that, whatever history may provide for us coming down the line. But overall, right, we're not going to know. I don't think we'll ever get the true history of things. And just like what happened a year ago, I've had this conversation with other commentators and writers where if you were to ask someone our age or older, what are the famous photographs of the 21st century? You have a pretty fine line where you can kind of tell, well, like these will be famous photos like 9/11 or even in 2013 with that small Turkish or Syrian infant that had drowned off of Turkey. But even then, our camera phones are everywhere. Smartphones come with 3 or 5 different cameras nowadays. So the value of a historical photograph, like the one where Trump's bleeding out of his ear and he's raising his fist telling you to fight, that kind of went and just became another photo of the Trump administration or the Trump phenomenon that has been now over a decade since he announced his candidacy coming down the elevator just earlier last month. And so it really does come to show that, these things happened. They're very historical. And that because of how fast our social media and our information comes to us now through our technology, we kind of pass over the historical or political significance of these events, whether it's Trump's survival or the loss of Corey Compatore's life.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point. Something that it's easy. A lot of people are angry with Trump right now. Understandably, I think there have been some decisions recently that should have questions put to them. But it is important to remember how much worse this timeline could be, right? that we very easily could have been in a truly horrific position. Possible civil war, most certainly a Kamala Harris presidency or something equivalent. And so just extremely important to remember that for the slight turn of a head, the entire world could be very different. And I wonder, in retrospect, we'll get to the how quickly everyone's moved on in a moment, because I think that is a very important discussion to have as well. But in hindsight, I remember as soon as Trump got hit, that visceral, him standing up, pumping his fist, fight, 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 the blood pouring from his ear, defiantly pushing back against Secret Service as they tried to haul him off stage. In that moment, of course, it was all about glad he survived and feeling terrible for Compatore's family and everything that happened there. But a few days later, after the natural feeling and everything was occurring, you start to you can't help it, especially if it's your job to work in politics. You start to think about the political ramifications. And I remember at that time, saying very explicitly, now is not a question of whether Trump wins. It's a question of whether or not he gets like a Reagan style landslide, right? If he gets a Nixonian landslide that really cements everything. And it's kind of amazing that for a while, that was not something people believed. After a few months, that all faded in the background, and it was Kamala Harris's brat, and she's got some video with a coconut on the internet, so she must be super. She eats Doritos, and so she's suddenly the social media star. There really was this attempt to take this like once in a lifetime event and almost immediately wash it out of the public memory and say, no, actually, this is a viable candidate. Now, I always thought that there was a lot of smoke and mirrors there. I always thought that she was very unpopular. But it really was something that even a lot of conservatives picked up and ran with. It was like this assassination attempt was almost immediately washed out of the public consciousness and replaced with this idea that actually Kamala Harris was a really viable candidate. Obviously, what ended up happening is that Donald Trump completely trounced her. We saw a large mandate, not a Nixonian second term or a Reagan second term win, but still a very substantial one, more than much more than any Republican has received, basically in my lifetime, my adult lifetime for sure. And so ultimately, it was clear, but that Trump was winning. But how much of that win do you think can be attributed to the events in Butler? and how much of it was just, Kamala Harris was already terrible and Trump was already going to win anyway.
Well, it certainly gave the Trump campaign a great optical. You couldn't ask for a more theatrical style third act comeback for a main character. And in fact, our mutual friend Morgoth's Review had kind of written this piece after the election of Trump where it was like only Trump can embody this like echo of the 80s action star and the third act comeback. And because he's the living embodiment of that sort of 80s American capital and chauvinism and just that swagger that came with that decade. And now we get to kind of live that third act, so to speak. But also on top of that, I mean, we found out after the election that according to the Harris as well as the Trump campaigns from internal polling, that there wasn't a single poll where Harris came out on top. You already had, I think, Trump more or less cemented in a good position after the first debate with Biden. And then you take a famously unpopular Democratic candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris, didn't poll above 1% during any time in the 2020 primary. She was brought on board because she was literally a diversity hire and because Biden needed to win Jim Clyburn's support in the South Carolina primary by promising he'd have a woman of color as his vice presidential pick. And so while Butler, for us, I think on the base, kind of cemented that there was no greater avatar of middle American radicals like what Sam Francis would write about, even though he's not a middle American at all. Butler really just came to conclude that, like, no, if there was any, even if you're not a believer in like the divine right of kings or divine providence or whatever, there was no greater sign right then and there to say, all right, this man is in charge of the movement. This man is in charge of the Republican Party. And this miraculous event more or less cemented that in the public consciousness. And I think whoever was going to vote for him just wanted to scream harder and vote for him more if they could. So I don't know how much of it contributes to the election, but it certainly contributes to the aura that this was a man, and I mean, even Trump said it just days after Butler going to the RNC to take on the nomination officially, that, he had been spared by God. Whether you believe that or not, it's a whole other story, but I mean, it does issue the optics there that this is the man that has been chosen by factors beyond human control.
Now, as you mentioned, obviously, we seem to go through this. The news cycle seemed to make this irrelevant almost immediately. It was shocking the speed at which this all moved. And a big part of that was the attempted assassins themselves. We know, obviously, as you mentioned, this wasn't the first time that there had been an intention to assassinate Trump, but obviously getting hit on live television is a very different thing. And, a lot of people looked at Thomas Matthew Crooks. They looked at basically his entire lack of presence online. Very little information was issued about his motivations. The left, of course, immediately is like, well, as a Trump supporter, because what else are they going to say, right? Like, obviously, their people are assassinating people. They're not going to own that. But there, he had donated to an Act Blue cause at some point, but it wasn't anything serious. Seemed largely apolitical in some ways. His parents eventually reported that they had concern about his mental health, but nothing significant was found about, I think, his larger political project. And obviously the circumstances around the assassination, the fact that he was allowed to get on a roof so very close that it seemed that the Secret Service was relatively incurious about a guy crawling around on a building very close to the president during that time, that his details seemed woefully unprepared for this kind of situation. They weren't even, we can't clear the roof because it's got an angle on it, like just insane justifications for this. You think back to the assassination of Kennedy, and obviously this is a successful assassination, so it's going to hold on to the public imagination more. But that has been something that people have been obsessed about for years and years and years and years, and it has been such a huge part. To this day, people want to see all of the Kennedy assassination files. And yet we hear almost nothing about the fact that, the Secret Service seemed to put little to no effort into actually securing the most important candidate, opposition candidate of that moment, that we know very little about the shooter. We also know very little about Ryan Routh and who attempted to ambush Trump later on the golf course. It just seems that the American public is very incurious about these events. And the question is, has something shifted in the American psyche where like violence against the president just isn't as big a deal? Or is it really the media? The fact that the media does not feed this, and without the media feeding the constant attention, Americans will just go wherever. They won't focus on it no matter what happens.
Well, it's funny. As soon as we started talking about this, the Republican Study Committee apparently is hosting some kind of press conference on, the anniversary of the Butler shooting. We'll see if they have anything to say. Maybe
Hopefully
there's
some breaking news there. Yeah,
yeah,
maybe this whole
some
show
breaking
will be
news.
irrelevant.
Yeah, maybe. But I'm not holding my breath that they're gonna tell me anything new. Just like with other big political events, things usually get kicked to Congress or some committee or some investigation or a commission, and then we're buried, left trying to dig through whatever report Congress produces and things like that. I mean, for JFK, it's the Warren Commission. For the 9/11 attacks, it's the 9/11 Commission report, where people are still questioning and talking about stuff to this day. We become so partisan, and also it's just because there's no collective American sense of Americanism. There's no American identity that really holds the country together anymore, like even 9/11 or with the JFK assassination. There's no greater understanding of like, oh, well, I didn't vote for Kennedy, or I was going to vote for Goldwater in '64 against Kennedy, but he's still the president and I still respect him. And it's the same thing with 9/11, even though, the country was still different then. Like, that was an attack on American soil, something that we hadn't really seen since Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so now all of a sudden you're like, well, what do we do? And of course, America has been radicalized by a facilitated invasion, both through legal means of various immigration laws, as well as the Biden administration and others just shipping random third world, nationals into middle America, or, the open migrant invasion that Biden ushered in hopes to sort of permanently demographically suppress the country and, stop Trump from winning or stop Trump from getting anything done. And so it's hard to say like, oh, well, why aren't we covering this more often? Why isn't this a big deal? And you have a media institution, an apparatus of government, partisans, activists, and the rest. I mean, this is, of course, all with the violence that happened in 2020. This is everything on top of the fact that the entire world had declared, since he went down that escalator a little over 10 years ago, that this man is somehow a, New York reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, despite the fact that, his closest friends and advisors are all individuals of Jewish background. And he was a real estate guy, not a politician or a war veteran or anything like that. And we decided, that the anti-fascist state was going to be all on board. And so, yeah, if we're anything to stop, the second coming of this great 20th century devil. And you and I have kind of read, the works of Renaud Camus, and how, the Great Replacement's become a thing, and that's heavily implicated in that, is that anti-fascism. So yeah, we're not going to cover it. Why would they cover it? They engage in the delight of hurting people that vote for him. They want things to be that way. We've seen the worst kind of Democratic spokesperson. I mean, let's keep in mind that their idea of winning young men back is to have people like Destiny and Hassan on their side, and they're celebrating the death of girls who had drowned tragically in Kerrville, Texas due to natural disaster. So it's, of course, they're not going to cover this and treat this like a great American tragedy, because to the progressives, to the left, to their ethnic voting blocks, the representation of white Americans is worthy to be destroyed, and they cheer it on. So of course it's not going to have the same coverage as national tragedies and events of the past, because there is no collective American sense of identity where all of us can come together and be like, this is a great important event that we should take stock of.
Well, and many people will find this cynical, but I think that, being people who assess politics and the flow of power, these are questions that have to be asked. Obviously, when the Democrats had something like January 6th, they leveraged it as hard as possible to eliminate their political enemies, right? A bunch of MAGA grandmas walked around, a building, and we were ushered inside, stayed inside velvet ropes, that kind of thing, took some pictures. And that was used to chase down, to, purge the American military and get rid of all of these different groups, different organizations on the right, prosecute people, hunt down, basically just a blank check for all of the administration's enemies. If there was any way they could make their lives hell, they did, right? They used this as a casus bell against basically all of the right. Now, you would think that a presidential assassination would be a pretty good excuse to do the same thing, right? You can order commissions, you can do inquiries, you can subpoena people, you can look for connections. Hey, this guy was inspired by Antifa. This guy was inspired by this ideology. You can start getting names. You can start getting roll calls. You can start going after these people in a very real way. And yet we have not seen any of this for the Trump administration. Now, currently, obviously, the Trump administration is having a lot of problems. We promise we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but yeah, the Epstein files has really grasped a lot of the conservative conversation, what's going on. And the Trump administration's excuse to not really addressing that stuff has been more or less, well, the DOJ is really busy, right? We're really busy working on all these other cases, and the FBI has to go after real stuff. And so we just don't have time to chase down all of this, all of this Epstein stuff and figure it out. And there would probably be a lot. I'd be more receptive to that explanation if we were rolling up Democrat, organizations left and right. If we were booking thousands of Antifa violent rioters and protesters and organizers, if we were defunding and stripping away credentials and disbarring people and having them lose medical licenses and professional licenses if they were in any way involved in any of the organizations that ultimately help to fuel the ideology of shooters. If we were doing these kinds of things with our time, I'd say, okay, I don't like that this is getting pushed to the side, but look at the Trump administration just throwing our enemies in jail for or destroying their organizations that help to create this really violent attack against the president and this air of being able to take shots at the president in a very literal sense. If there was more of that, then I'd be more persuaded on the idea that the DOJ is just too busy to mess with the Epstein stuff. But we haven't seen any of this leverage. Do you think this is just because the Trump administration generally just has goodwill towards these people? They don't want to see it be seen abusing power. They just haven't gotten it together yet, or these things are coming. What are your thoughts on to why the right has not used this very obvious attack against the American way of life and the political norms inside our society to roll up their enemies in the way that the Democrats have?
Well, I think a lot of it does have to do with just how power is wielded. I mean, yeah, I think a good example of this would be like all the work that Christopher Rufo has done with some doctor who had blown the whistle on a lot of transgender child mutilation stuff that has happened. I think it was in Texas. And at no point in time has Governor Greg Abbott stepped in to like try and clear him or to provide political coverage on any of these issues. And if you're doing these in red states, that should be like, this is a basic culture war victory 101. And it like gives red meat to my base, because oftentimes, red state governors will do a lot of things that the base likes and then a lot of things that they don't. I mean, Abbott's a really good example of this. But even on top of that, you've got for the Epstein stuff, regardless of whatever your position might be on that issue, number one, it is a very, very bad PR 101 screw up. You do not go back a couple of months ago where Pam Bondi is talking about the thousands of hours of footage, all of the files. I've got the list, and we're going to invite all these conservative influencers to talk about that. And this isn't to denigrate the influencers. I would take an opportunity if someone at the White House was like, hey, do you want to come on board and talk about this like a major story and break it to your audience? Yeah, I would say take that in a heartbeat. My froggy self would be right up there right now. But you can't go from there and then to say he did kill himself, we have no client list, and we're not doing this, despite the fact that Epstein died during the first Trump administration. It got Alex Acosta in trouble. And we had to go back into his history back when he was in Florida in 2007, 2008, when they had to have charges dropped against Jeffrey Epstein with allegations of trafficking and the rest. So major PR screw up, number one. And then, like you had said, number two, I would probably be, I'm still upset about it, but at the same time, I probably would be a lot less upset about that if, I don't know, we were opening investigations into Representative Ilhan Omar and the false marriage allegedly to her brother and trying to process on getting all these Somalians out of there. Meanwhile, another anti-American, anti-Trump Somali guy wants to run for the mayor of Minneapolis in Minnesota. And it's like, oh, interesting how all the people that are ruining Minnesota just happen to not be from Minnesota to begin with. And All of those things are on the board. And, you and I have joked about tanks in Harvard Yard and stuff like that. And it's just like, well, none of that's happened. But we also have to kind of understand, like, yeah, there's no magic wand where poof, everything that we get is going to be magically granted to us in politics. But when you're scrambling and going back on things that you had said just months ago about one of the greatest areas of political intrigue, foreign influence, and foreign intelligence operations, not happening just inside the United States, but globally, there's a lot of things that we're not going to know about. I'm sure there's probably cause that maybe we don't want to cause an international scandal, or worse, that there is foreign pressure on the American government. And that's also a huge red flag, because the American government should be only held and sovereign to the American people, not a foreign nation. But overall, like, if they were doing more, I would appreciate that. But I also have to understand, just like with the first Trump administration, everything is stacked against them. But it does put a lot of questions of confidence and competence into who Trump has at these positions of power.
So speaking of kind of promises that Trump has made, when he was on the campaign trail, Trump said repeatedly, I'll have a deal done the first day I'm in. The Ukraine war will be over. The Russia-Ukraine war would have never happened if I had been in charge. And as soon as I'm back in charge, I'm going to clean this out immediately. Now, Trump obviously is very bombastic. He makes a lot of, hyperbolic claims. I don't think anyone really believed day one he was going to immediately just make a phone call and end this thing. But obviously his rhetoric gave you a general sense that we were moving towards the end of this war. And let's be honest, the war only exists because the United States is funding Ukraine. It is functionally a proxy war between the United States and other NATO partners and Russia, using every man in Ukraine as long as they can. And so, as difficult as it would be, ultimately, I think, for these guys to kind of take a lump on this one, if the United States simply walked away and said, we are no longer funding Ukraine and the chips are going to fall where they may, then the war would end itself more or less. Russia would probably win, take a decent amount of what it wanted, and then we would move forward. That's, again, a not ideal outcome. It's not like I'm pro Putin in any way, but those are just the realities on the ground. Russia may not have had the easy time it would have wanted in Ukraine, but it also is very clearly, I think, winning that war decisively, even despite having to face down the funding of a large amount of the Western world. And in the process, we have sent a lot of our munitions to Ukraine. Like many other countries, we have delved dangerously deep into stockpiles of limited resources in order to continue to because as Lindsey Graham would say, as long as we're killing Russians with they can kill Russians with our ammunition all day long, as we don't have to put any Americans on the ground. It's all upside for us. And we end up in the scenario where Trump is now saying he's going to have to send Patriot batteries to Ukraine. These are not just completely defensive weapon systems. They're offensive weapon systems. And so we have this scenario where Trump, said we were getting out of this war. Obviously, we had the strike in Iran, which is its own animal, and we're continuing to fund Ukraine. Now, a lot of people pointed out, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, that ultimately Trump wants to be in a position to negotiate with Putin. And much like Iran trying to get a bomb so that it can, not so that it can fire it at the U.S. because it couldn't anyway, but so that it can have that threshold potential in order to put itself in a better position in the negotiating table and force people to the negotiating table. It feels like Trump is basically sending these weapon systems not because he ultimately believes that Ukraine's going to use them to win the war, but that this will somehow give him a better negotiating position with Putin, who otherwise seems resistant to making a deal. So, as somebody who focuses a little more on geopolitics and international relations, what do you think the move is here? Is this Trump doubling down on the war in Ukraine? Is he looking for a continued and extended conflict in this area? Is he going to maintain the status quo? Or is this, a 40 chess move to set himself up to actually do the deal he wants to get done?
Well, there's a lot of pressures, I think, on the Trump administration to maintain a presence in Ukraine. I mean, not just the neoconservative or Ukrainian lobby that wants to keep this war going, either A, in perpetuity, or B, or until Russia is completely repelled out of 2014 to go return to that, pre-2014 territorial border and the political borders that existed then. But also that you have European allies that are greatly concerned. I mean, as soon as Trump had gotten to office or taken on this de facto role that he was going to be the guy to win the Republican nomination, I mean, it was Britain and France had talked about trying to do things on their own, or at least act as some sort of political and strategic tripwire to keep the United States involved. And of course, there's the looming Article 5 question. But at the end of the day, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, the United States doesn't actually completely control Ukraine. During the course of this conflict, there had been talks between then Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the Russian Ministry of Defense and Foreign Minister about what had been going on, sort of trying to talk to each other about, was this something that you guys signed off on? Was this the Ukrainians doing? And despite attempts to negotiate or offer ceasefires and have peace talks, either Zelensky would not go, or Putin wouldn't acknowledge it, or the United States would be pursuing terms that neither party really liked. And that even while you're negotiating, as we see in conflict and as we see during all these, they're called like rational choice theories or the bargaining model of war, that even while you're negotiating, you're still going to pursue and maneuvers that are going to put you in a strategically advantageous position and thus in a diplomatically advantageous position, because you now have more tactical leverage over the battlefield and thus the negotiating table. Both Russia and Ukraine have been going at each other's throats. There still hasn't really been any stop to the conflict. There's been an increase in air attacks. There's been an increase in drone usage. And that, of course, drags in countries like Turkey and Iran and China and North Korea now for munitions and the rest of things like that. So it trying to end this also means that it's not just the Russians we're dealing with here. It's also the Ukrainians, and it's also the nations that I had just mentioned that want to be involved or have a, leverage at the negotiating table. And with our European partners as well. I mean, the Trump had announced with the new secretary of NATO about what they're going to do in a press conference in the White House just the other day, and that we're selling upwards of about $10 billion of equipment is what I had read. And it's a sale, and it's meant to, say that this isn't the United States doing it directly. So you're trying to give yourself that strategic and political distance from your own actions, even though you're openly supporting this military power in this conflict. It's difficult because at the same time, there had been discussions that Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as Trump likes to now call him, Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio had been doing these reviews about munitions. But the main question is still at the end of the day, like, how can we replace these things? We're still not producing as much of our own munitions, and we're selling a lot of surplus that we might need in another conflict or anything that we might want to pursue for our own defense capability. It puts us, I think, in a strategically precarious position, but also that, Trump has tried his best to negotiate over the last 5 months and has tried probably talking behind the scenes as well during the campaign trail. Nothing has managed to successfully come to a conclusive peace in that area, in the same way that there really hasn't been a conclusive peace to what's been going on in Gaza or in the Strait of Hormuz with Iran either. So, you're going to have to pursue the pressure. And if that means sending more offensive or defensive armaments, that the very blurred fine line between that term, that you're going to have to deal with the fact that, okay, we haven't been able to get any of these guys to come to the negotiating table, get a managed settlement. So we have to continue to pursue all options available on the battlefield. Does that come with risk of escalation? Yes. But so far, all parties involved are still talking to each other. It's really concerning when they stop talking to each other diplomatically or even behind the scenes through back channels. And so far, that hasn't happened yet. So at least in my perspective, probably not what Trump had wanted to do to get the war to end, but I think that he has tried to pursue peace at every available option, at least publicly speaking. And now to be doing this, yeah, I'm sure it does irritate a lot of the anti-war, the anti-Ukraine crowd inside of his base or inside of Congress. But at the same time, it's not like Russia is a particularly strong ally of the United States either. And, the United States has unfortunately gotten itself involved with two very corrupt Eastern European powers, one of which we've been playing, what's been known as the Great Game between either England or now the United States and Russia for centuries. And this conflict is going to continue to see itself out until its logical conclusion on the battlefield. But hopefully this renewed pressure does bring parties back to the negotiating table, but only time will tell.
Is there any scenario where the United States simply walks away from this, says, look, if we stop funding Ukraine, then whatever happens, happens? Or does it need to be a deal? You have to get the peace treaty. You have to work out things from all sides. I mean, I know ultimately that's ideal. You secure a certain level of global stability, and you save a certain amount of face, makes it clear that you're still a major player that everyone has to bend the knee to. Ultimately sets you up in a situation where trade and other things are much safer without this constant conflict. But is there any efficacy to the idea that America just stops the funding and walks away, or is that just a political impossibility at this point?
Well, I think it's a political impossibility because I don't think Congress would allow it, and they're still constitutionally speaking the ones in charge of the purse. I mean, yes, there's a lot of leeway the executive branch. I mean, since really Eisenhower onward in American history, where the executive branch can kind of do what it wants without really congressional approval, as long as they submit some kind of notice, as we see with authorized use of military force, war powers, the rest, etc. But I mean, there's also the European question in mind. A lot of people see Trump's actions as, either abandoning its sort of security mantle in Europe from the post-war order. There's been a lot of discussion about from the French as well as from other European leaders about trying to decouple itself from the United States. And typically that, usually means just going closer towards China, which has been what a lot of American pundits and a lot of American security experts, both Republican and otherwise, have said would not be in American interest at all to see one of America's closest trading and security partners now be closer to its greatest geopolitical threat in terms of the economy, as well as its strategic and political influence and infiltration inside the United States. So I don't see a situation where Trump says, we've done everything we can, we're walking away. Also, Trump has threatened this before. I mean, this administration has threatened to sort of walk away from things and let things go where they lay, and they've kind of always come back to it for a variety of reasons. So I don't see it being realistic. I think that personally, Trump probably wants the nice big peace treaty or some kind of negotiated settlement where he can say peace and that I managed to accomplish this in my administration. No other president's done this. But again, I'm not a soothsayer. I have no idea. But to me, I don't see ourselves upping and leaving anytime soon.
So obviously, this conflict is a ugly meat grinder, and I don't think that ultimately the Russians want to send their young men into it more than anyone else does. But is there a level at which this conflict is advantageous for Russia because it's become an Afghanistan of sorts that's just siphoning the munitions and the all these other? I mean, obviously, Russia would rather just win this war, but it is in a way the U.S. was like, "Haha, we will kill so many Russians without having to put any of our troops on the ground. What a victory for us!" And in a way, it's more like Russia saying, "Okay, no, you're now trapped with us here. You have to burn all of this money. You have to burn all these munitions, all this political and military capital is being extended on a regular basis, and we're going to win this inevitably anyway. So we're just grinding your resources and your political will while we move towards inevitable victory." Is that a possible way that Russia is looking at the conflict now, and why they might not be interested in running to the table to get this deal done?
Potentially, it was funny when the conflict had started, or right before the invasion in Ukraine had started. I had said that two things happen: either the increased presence on the border from America and NATO allies kind of deters Russia from doing anything, or this conflict turns into something akin to the Syrian civil war, where there's going to be millions of dollars and billions of dollars of weapons pouring in. There's going to be militias and terror groups that will get a hold of this stuff and cause untold damage, and we'll be there for a decade. Now, I hope we're not there for a decade, but so far we've been there now for several years, and we've spent billions of dollars trying to train people to give away vital munitions. And of course, there is nothing more advantageous than for our enemies to look at how our munitions interact with their own military equipment, as well as the fact that even we have had to respond to that. I mean, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had already talked about, unleashing America's drone potential, because everyone and their mother has now seen hundreds of thousands of people, through footage online that we can all go look up, where people are blown away and mutilated and killed almost instantly through, FPV and other drone footage of, just people getting blown up with loitering munitions that they can just drop at will from a long distance. It's not like what we were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq with Predator drones. Far more different, far more dehumanizing, and far more up close and personal. I think that the Russians kind of have benefited from the fact that this wartime economy has kind of allowed them to show off their industrial muscle. They have produced a lot of things domestically, even more neoliberal commentators in The Economist magazine have pointed out that the Russian economy has not suffered the effects that a lot of people thought would from sanctions or trying to cripple them internationally on the world stage. And of course, we're still watching other countries go and find ways to get around sanctions when it comes to purchasing Russian oil and natural gas, whether it's via India and it being resold at a higher rate back to European countries or even to the United States and others in the Western Hemisphere. So, there's probably a benefit in the Russian calculus where they're like, well, we can throw people in from, the backwater or the former Soviet satellite states or even those from North Korea. So, we'll throw as many as we can to do this in the same way that I'm sure the Ukrainians are happy to have militias and other groups come in and do these things, which, of course, makes it a hotbed for terrorism and makes whatever kind of peace or ceasefire harder to attain, because now people that are on a mission either to, achieve some ethnic blood feud and accomplish a genocide or whatever, they now all have access to weapons, intelligence, and arms dealers. So that area becoming a terror hotspot in the decades to come wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. So I think peace is going to be harder, but I'm sure it's somewhere in the Russian calculus where they know that they can keep the United States and Western Europe effectively bogged down politically, economically, and militarily in this region for several years to come.
So our last topic today is, the fact that the media has been slowly rolling out the fact that Joe Biden obviously wasn't the president of the United States. And this has been, it reminds me very much of the COVID stuff where obviously they were lying about the origins of the disease and silencing anyone who had any questions about it. And then over time, when it became clear that the lab leak theory wasn't just crazy or conspiracy theory, but the obvious truth, we got this slow drip of information coming out of liberal sources. Well, maybe it was the lab and maybe the wet market thing wasn't real. And eventually we got the full-blown New York Times story, and it was okay for your aunt who read the New York Times to admit the thing you had known for 3 years that she had screamed at you for being a conspiracy theorist about. And we're undergoing the same thing, this disclosure after the fact in an attempt to kind of smooth over and repair the media apparatus and trying to basically stitch the reality back together after they've torn it apart, with one side saying, no, everything you see is a lie, and actually we dictate reality. At some point, they have to kind of like go back and stitch it together and be like, no, we kind of always said this. They've been admitting that Joe Biden has not been in charge. One of the things that's really been focused on is the use of the auto pen. Obviously, the president has to sign a lot of things. Traditionally, the auto pen was thought of this way to like sign birthday cards and proclamations and all the dignitary stuff that the president does that, doesn't have a policy load bearing aspect to it. And you can just churn it out. And that way the president isn't spending large chunks of his valuable day when he could be governing the nation, signing a bunch of cards for the Boy Scouts of, Tupelo, Mississippi or something. And instead, what it's become is this way for basically the autocracy, or I should say the oligarchy, to really run the presidency without the president. It gives them the ability to sign his name when he's not cogent or, can't be pushed more than a few hours a day because he's too old to function. And clearly Joe Biden was in this position quite often, rarely making any serious decisions, often having other members of the administration, lots of speculation whether Blinken or, Mayorkas or who was really having tons of influence in these scenarios. But it's very clear that the auto pen played a role. And recently, the New York Times confirmed something that a lot of people had suspected, that Joe Biden had very little control over or involvement in his pardoning process. Rather than having individual names brought to him, for the most part, his staff brought him entire blocks of people under particular criteria. So, okay, well, we might want to write them a pardon because they meet X or Y criteria. He would look at the criteria, say, okay, that looks fine. And then they would go and find the individuals that they were going to pardon. And in many cases, they were signing revisions on the pardon with the auto pen. And so the question, of course, is, what is the legitimacy of those pardons? And people had already raised this idea that the the pardons may not be legitimate because Joe Biden was not cognitively there. But on top of that, we now have confirmation that he didn't even evaluate individually or sign most of the intermediate paperwork involved in actually preparing and delivering those pardons. And this matters because a number of critical people who were involved in different cover-ups, be it COVID or the election, they have been identified as people who were pardoned with this auto pen mechanism. And so, especially with Donald Trump recently releasing this post saying, well, we're not going after Epstein or wasting our time on that because we have all this other stuff to do. And one of the main things he pushed was election integrity. The election was stolen, and we are going to be going after that. Pam Bondi is going to track these people down. The FBI is going to investigate. And if these pardons don't hold up, if they are actually something you can challenge, then perhaps that means there is more leeway to get some kind of retribution, some actual penalties for the people who abuse the American system. Do you ultimately think that the administration will pursue any of these individuals, that they will try to overturn or challenge any of these pardons? Or is all this information just going to be this post hoc rationalization, this disclosure after the fact that kind of takes out the trash and knits the narrative back to reality, but the Trump administration just doesn't take any shots at it?
Well, you had mentioned early on when we had talked about the Epstein files that you would probably be a little more okay with it if the Trump administration's DOJ was so busy going after its leftist and progressive enemies. Like, it would be nice to see RICO, act being read all over for those organizing Antifa or various organizations responsible for helping facilitate, migrants and human trafficking, but we're not seeing that either. So I don't know if anything will come out of this at all. I think that it's very similar to what we had with COVID, where, what you and I already knew gets confirmed by the media, and then everyone's given this collective hand wave, like, oh yeah, it's okay, like, you can forget about all this time that had passed. And it's that old American tradition where it's just like, hey, you remember that like terrible thing that we did that you never had proof of? Well, we declassified it, so what are you going to do about it, huh? And I feel like that's going to be part of this American tradition, because you and I've already talked about, I think in previous episodes, as well as on Twitter, where you have all these CNN journalists that are trying to rehabilitate Joe Biden and say, like, well, he was obviously non-compos mentis. He was obviously not always there. And, we're here to tell you the truth and shine light on it. It's like, okay, you're trying to rehabilitate your image after you've been a sycophant for Biden and the Democrats for as long as I've been alive, and longer than that. So why am I to believe you now? Like, you're not sunshine is the best disinfectant. You're here covering your own butt. Like, that's all that you're doing here. If the Trump administration wants to say and challenge either in court, or preferably just say, listen, these were signed with an auto pen. The president of the United States at the time was not mentally competent to do that. And I think even Peter Ducey, or however you say his name, in the White House press corps had even pointed it out during the last waning days or the early days of the Trump administration. Like, listen, the only one that has an authentic Joe Biden signature is the one that pardons his son. The rest are all an auto pen. Like, what are we going to do about this? And I don't think that there was ever really an official answer given. Does this hopefully light a fire under the Trump administration's rear end, under the DOJ, to do something? I think it would give Pam Bondi a necessary optical win in the media, especially for conservative media, if she said, yeah, we're looking into this, and those pardons are probably going to be reneged. And now we're going to open investigations into Fauci and everyone else that had been done so, because clearly these were illegitimate pardons, and we have the legal history to prove it. Until that happens, I feel like this is going to be, just like you said with COVID, something where the right wing is affirmed by the mainstream press years later, where nothing is going to happen as a result of consequence.
Unfortunately, I think you're right about that, and it's very dangerous. I know. We're always saying maybe at some point we'll hit an edge, right? At some point we'll hit a limit, and people won't take this anymore. And after COVID, sadly, my trust in the American people to actually, have a line that won't be crossed is pretty much gone. I think that people are gonna take almost anything that's been handed to them at this point and swallow it. So it's not that I think that tomorrow people are going to wake up and recognize what's going on, but it does just degrade the ability of any Americans to believe that there are political solutions and political participation has any kind of consequence. And that's a really dangerous place to be, I think, ultimately, especially when we're in the position we're in, where you recognize that even if you win this election, you put someone like Trump in charge, can you actually get any kind of justice? Can you actually get any kind of retribution? Will anyone pay a cost for locking everyone in their homes, getting people killed because they couldn't get cancer treatment? Will anyone pay a cost for shooting at Donald Trump? Will anyone pay a cost for not protecting this man? Will anyone pay a cost for these different all these different things? Will the Biden administration ever pay the toll for basically having a coup in the United States and taking over the presidency and putting up a puppet that in no way actually ran the country and then trying to swap him in for another puppet? As people see that then the other shoe never drops, that this is going to constantly, I think, create a huge rift in American society, and nothing good happens for the body politic. But sadly, I feel like your assessment is more realistic than I'd like it to be. So that said, we have a number of questions of the people stacking up here.
I'm sure.
So, Mr. Prudentialist, now that we've ended on this glorious and happy note, where can people find your excellent work?
You can find me anywhere where you see this amphibian on screen. I'm on Twitter at Mr. Prudentialist. I'm on Substack, theprudentialist.substack.com, as well as on YouTube. I have a brand new video out called Tweet Me Deadly, talking about our media ecosystem and how it affects our ability to be very AB when it comes to politics. Like the Epstein thing is a really good example where we can say it's either one thing or the other, and there's no ability for us to discern what's actually going on because we've kind of been programmed to post, and we're not really looking into how we can discern actual truth because that's basically been destroyed. And it's really important, Auron, as you had said, like all of this does is it gives people the illusion that there is no political solution, or that it tells people that there is no political solution. And what that gives people is this sense of illusion where they can take matters into their own hands. And we already know that the left has no problem doing that because they've tried killing ICE agents. There were, it was like a trans terror group that killed one in the transition period between Biden and Trump. I think it was in November of last year after the election. We've had people try and shoot up ICE facility raids. We've had makeshift basically almost not IEDs, but we've had very close things trying to take out ICE vans carrying agents as well as illegal immigrants that they're sending off for deportation. And all of this is really telling the left is that the Trump administration isn't going to do anything about their actions outside of posting some really cringe memes about swiping right on, marriage fraud with ICE. And don't get me wrong, it's good to shut down marriage fraud, but you have to understand that there is an active network of left-wing paramilitaries that would love to reenact the days of rage against your administration. And I think that that's really more important than anything we discuss here is that for Trump's enemies, and by the extension, the enemies of the people that voted for him, that's their mindset that they're under if he doesn't crack down.
Yeah, and while I appreciate the Department of Homeland Security taking one of my memes, it would be nice to see them arresting Antifa members, not just posting my internet work. So really hoping that we do see some significant consequences, because if we don't, then like you said, it really becomes, people, recognize that they have this kind of learned helplessness, no matter what they vote for, no matter who they're supporting, it's not going to make a difference. And then your question is like, do you just not care what happens at all, or do you take actions to your own hands? And as you point out, the left has already done this. It's extremely dangerous. It's not a place you want to be as a country. All right, guys, let's go to the questions of the people here. Manayud says, if there's anything that can be said about what happened in that day in Butler, it proves that God still plays in human affairs and that history hasn't stopped. Trump was shot, but Fukuyama is dead. Yeah, I think that's correct. It's, again, I know some people will get worked up over the idea that there's any divine interaction with our affairs, but sorry, there is, and obviously there was there, and I think that that's going to continue to be the case, and you're going to have to work harder and harder to deny that the things you see are somehow influenced by forces beyond your control, whether you like that or not.
That's very true. Although, for not to do the actually or fact check thing, but Fukuyama's still alive, and
of course, yeah.
I know like his book is a meme that a lot of people use, but I would really recommend people actually read it, because Fukuyama spends a lot of time talking about the critics of his thesis towards the end of the book, and he's more terrified of the right-wing critique of his idea than he is the left-wing one. So I'd recommend it, and if you ever get the chance, Warren, you might want to give him a call.
Well, the problem is I read, was it Liberalism and Its Discontents?
It was so
Uh,
bad.
it's so it's everything that people imagine end of history is, right? It's the problem is that Fukuyama started as a more complex and nuanced thinker and then became the meme. And so I don't, a lot of people will yell at me, "Oh, well, that's not what his book says. It's not what his book said." Okay, but eventually that's what he said. And so yes, I understand that he was more complex at one point, but now he is just a cartoon. And I'm sorry, but as long as he's going to run around and be the liberal Toby Keith, I'm going to mock him, right? Like, I'm sorry.
As you should.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Cripper Weirdo says, are we going to talk about Blue Anon in depth? Yeah, I know that people have like tried to brand the left and their conspiracy theories as this thing. And yeah, I'm sure it has some validity. I'm not here to tell you not to, do good propaganda if you can. I just think it has less of an impact because the main way the left sells the idea of conspiracy theories is they control the media outlets, right? So like you are of course entirely reasonable to ask questions about Jeffrey Epstein or COVID or any of these things, but the left controls whether or not that has any traction because they just get everyone on their platforms to say, oh, that's crazy, that's crazy, that's crazy. It doesn't work for the right because we don't control enough of the mainstream opinion shaping apparatus to drive that. It's a little less true now than it used to be. You can get a little more traction with that, but trust me, even though your wine aunt on MSNBC has been completely brainwashed into believing the Russiagate scandal and supporting Ukraine and buying into every 19th shot on COVID, none of this will register as a conspiracy theory for them. It's just never going to matter to them that you call them conspiracy theorists, because ultimately the sources that tell them what are right and wrong are telling them that yes, they are correct to continue to believe in these lies. And I just don't think that's going to change. Florida Henry says, looking at the numbers, both candidates got below 50%. Also, 1,000 votes switched. Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Kamala and Waltz would have won the Electoral College. Scary, very scary. No mandate. I mean, I'm sorry. Like you win. If you win every branch, like if you want to run the numbers and find the razor's edge, you can do that. Obviously, Trump won the Electoral College by the most in quite a while for a Republican, and actually won the popular vote, or very close, depending, I guess, on how you want to parse this. But ultimately, I think it was a significant win for Trump, and I really don't think it does anyone any good to play that down. It is again, it was not a Nixonian or Reagan-like victory. I'm not trying to pretend it was that kind of landslide, but I think calling it a mandate is pretty fair. I don't understand what it gets you to deny that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time that a Republican had won the popular vote since George W. Bush's reelection campaign in 2004. But
Right.
also, I mean, we can split hairs on the voting numbers. The reason why we're never going to have a Nixonian or a Reagan-esque sort of mass landslide where it's like 48 or 49 states go red is because we do not have the demographics of 1972 or 1984 America. If we ever return to those demographics again, then yeah, those kind of landslides are possible for Republican candidates. But until the tide of that is stemmed and that is lowered, then we can split hairs like that, and it would be justified in my opinion. But Trump did do something that is politically unseen as a comeback story, so we should at least give him that.
Yeah, I get pretty frustrated with people. Like if you want to look at what Trump's doing right now and be angry at him, by all means. I'm not going to pretend that's not the case. But guys, don't do the pro-lifers made this mistake with Trump, where he doesn't use exactly the rhetoric I like, and therefore I need to completely abandon him and run DeSantis in his place or something else. And they all just ended up looking really idiotic. And Trump got Planned Parenthood funding removed. He got Roe versus Wade overturned, not by himself, obviously, but he presided over those victories. He's won more victories than all the people who used your rhetoric when you wanted them to. And I feel like the same thing has happened with some of the right, the online right now. They're like, well, Trump isn't doing everything I ever wanted. And we should criticize him when he doesn't do the right thing. But like, don't just immediately throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't ignore the accomplishments that Trump has made. Don't ignore the fact or rewrite history and pretend like he did not win in a spectacular fashion just because you're currently angry at him. I just it seems very stupid. It seems to be cutting off your nose to spite your face. I just don't understand it. Creepy Weirdo says, I ask because it shows that the left really has nothing to attack the right with. We are not as forgiving as we once were. Well, the left certainly doesn't have much to attack the right with right now, though we're doing our best to hand that back to them. But seriously, when you think about it, what is the left doing right now? Where is the left? Right? Like they're desperately hoping we get into some kind of extended war so they at least have something to talk about. Because ultimately, all they can do is push like defending wife beaters and drug dealers and gang members and pushing some foreign, Africa, India by way of Africa socialist in New York. Like this is what they got. It's no traction. The immigration riots and terrorism in LA. Like that's what they're going to stand on. The left is still floundering at the moment. They still have not found a place to stand. We're working really hard to give it to them. But at this moment, I just don't think they have much.
Well, I'm probably going to disagree. I think that what has kind of come to pass in this instance is that the left, sure, on a national level, may not have much to flounder or put out morbidly obese Mexican women to talk about how to win back young men. But when we look in the cities and we look in places where they have the numbers, whether it's in New York or Minneapolis, we're seeing the future of what the Democratic Party is, which is the logical conclusion of, invade the world, invite the world. And we're going to witness a 2025, Africa Adio play out in virtually every Democratic institution in the United States. Like David Hogg will get kicked out. Yeah, sure, because he's straight, white, and male, in the same way that you have a lot of podcasters trying to rehabilitate and try and make sort of this moderating, masculine force of Gavin Newsom something. But at the end of the day, I mean, what we're really kind of witnessing here for like, what is the left doing or what are Democrats doing is that they still have a variety of institutions that will support them and will happily relent and offer their support. Like people that are considered moderate Democrats have already thrown their support behind the presumptive new incoming mayor of New York. I'm sure that there'll be a lot of support for the guy running for the mayor of Minneapolis, who's a Somalian. I just think that, they're going to just probably embrace in a very Camp of the Saints fashion the people that they've imported as their liberators as they burn the oak door that their ancestors crafted.
It's fair. And you're right that in these cities where the demographics have permanently shifted and they feel that they can fully embrace this third worldism, this hatred of the United States and its people unapologetically, you're right. They are getting bolder in those areas. You wonder if that necessarily loses them anything with the remaining, American population. The answer might be no. It might be that doubling down on this kind of woke ideology, especially when it comes to this third worldist, derivative. Then yeah, it could ultimately be that is the winning strategy for them. I do wonder if it won't cost them something nationwide. But you're certainly right that it is significant that in urban areas where they have this footprint, where they have this stronghold, they do feel emboldened to double down on it, and they don't see themselves losing much for it, or they don't care.
Yeah, I certainly hope I'm wrong on that point, Auron, but so far
Yeah,
that seems to be the case.
Yeah. Philosophical Thirstworm says the DOJ isn't releasing the Epstein files. Sure, okay, but the DOJ is also not doing anything else. Bondi's on Fox 24/7 with zero arrests. Yeah, and again, that really is the issue. I would not be okay with the Epstein stuff getting put under the rug in any sense. But if you were at least, like I said, like we both said, if you were deporting, if we had 10 million deportations on the slate, and we were rolling up Antifa cells, and we were defunding every one of the organizations that had ever had any contact with any of the assassins, or taken a donation from any of these guys, if we were really leveraging all this stuff and Pam Bondi was just putting left-wing terrorists in jail all the time while we airlifted millions of illegals out of here, I'd probably be a little less, preoccupied with whether or not there was any there for the Epstein files. But since we're getting none of that, it becomes very obvious very quickly.
Yeah, and there was a great thread by a gentleman, I think he goes by like Tom Brady, THOM Brady on Twitter, where he says, Pam Bonnie's getting a lot of the flack because she has no PR wins in the way that Stephen Miller or Tom Homan have when it comes to the issues that they've placed her in charge of. And so she's getting most of the flack, and rightfully so, because the DOJ, while I'm sure it has done a lot of things that would constitute wins, it doesn't appear so to the American media, and especially to the conservative base, because we would be covering them if we thought they were good or she had really racked up something we thought was like a big W. But it does come to show that, we would like to see more happen. I understand it's 6 months. I understand that, you can't wave a magic wand and undo decades of, the deep state or whatever. Like, it is going to be a problem. I do agree. But at the same time, a little more aggression would be great.
And Thirstworm follows up saying, I can understand that Trump doesn't want to lose 5 Senate votes and his term gets absorbed by the Epstein stuff, but Bondi isn't doing anything else. And again, yeah, I can't help but agree. I actually, sorry, I actually basically just made the same case to Tom Woods. I was just on his show, and I said, look, under no circumstances would I be okay with burying the Epstein stuff. But yeah, I understand why the Trump administration doesn't want this to take. I mean, the likelihood is that releasing this would unspool most of the Western ruling class. And while many of us hearing those words would get very excited, the truth is, if you're a guy like Donald Trump, who really just wanted to close the border and have a good economy, he would recognize that none of that stuff would get done. And this would basically engulf his entire presidency. And does he want to do that? I don't think that justifies anything he's doing. But if you do ultimately make that calculation, then yeah, you got to get some wins on the board, right? Like, you have to justify why you are sidestepping this. So we need to see massive wins. And if that's not coming, then the questions become, well, Pam Bondi's not doing anything else and she's not doing this. What are we doing here?
Yeah, agreed.
Matt Greer says, I don't like Pam Bondi, and it's not because of her embarrassing statements on Epstein. Hope this admin will wake up and start taking radical action. Yeah, and again, Trump has already doubled down behind Pam Bondi, and I think a lot of people aren't happy with that decision, but yeah, then you need to make some, we got to see some deliveries. If you're not delivering on any front, then you're going to get pushback. And by the way, say what you want about, the administration or MAGA fans. I think this proves once and for all that, the Trump following, the MAGA following is not a cult, that it does have principles. It does have goals. It's not just going to shut up every time Trump sells it to shut up. Yes, they're generally loyal to Trump. Yes, they're willing to give him a lot of leeway, but ultimately there is a result that has to occur. And the more we're not seeing that result, the more people are asking questions. The more the Trump administration delivers, the more good faith it has to say, hey, we know you want this, but we trust us. We've delivered on these 10 other things. And if this one thing isn't getting a priority, it's for a good reason. I am a little more inclined to listen to that when I've gotten 10 huge wins in a row. But when you're coming to me with not very many wins and saying just trust the plan, now I start to wonder.
Yeah, and again, if we see more deliveries in I know people listen in the administration to your show. I know that plenty of people are tapped in, and a lot of our former Twitter mutuals are now working in this administration. I know that they want us to have faith in them, and I know that they've earned it in a lot of ways over the years. But at the same time, I think it's really important for them to recognize taking some actual meaningful action against demographic change and radical left-wing terrorism that is funded by plenty of people. Like, we know the names of the people that did the majority of the funding for the No Kings protests. Like, you could investigate them under the DOJ for a variety of reasons, in the same way that Obama had the IRS target conservative groups in the wake of the 2012 election, or in the way that we saw under Joe Biden with January 6th and pro-lifers and everything like that. The precedent is there and the tools are at your disposal. We had said this after the Butler shooting a year ago, there is a crown in the gutter, and your head has been spared by the powers that be to ensure that you can pick that crown up and rule effectively. And as much as I like Tom Homan and Stephen Miller and others in the administration, if we had the same zeal that those individuals had in all facets of the executive branch, I'm sure that we would have a much different tone. And I think I can't speak for you, but I think this is pretty safe to say for both of us that we want Trump to succeed. We do.
Yes.
But I would like to also make sure that success actually happens.
I don't spend all my time becoming emotionally incontinent and railing against Trump because it's not productive. And I think ultimately it's not fair on a lot of levels. But as you point out, victory is its own argument here, right? Like if you guys are stacking W's, you're going to gain my trust on these issues much easier. If it's always an excuse and we can't quite get this done and we're not quite there yet across the board, I start to get very concerned. So you want to silence the critics, you want to earn the trust, you want me to say, okay, I don't know what's going on here, but these guys have just crushed it over and over again, so I'm going to believe them on this one, or I'm going to give them some space to figure this one out. You want that, guys? Let's go. Okay, let's the rhetoric's cool, the memes are cool, let's get it done. That's what people are looking for. Thirstworm finally says, YouTube won't even let me write what I really want to do to Ukraine at this point. All right. Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you coming by. As always, you should be checking out the Prudentialist stuff. If for some reason you have not done that, you should fix that immediately. If it's your first time on this channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe, click the bell, notifications, all that stuff so you know when we go live. And if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.